The Galactic Academy for Higher Learning was supposed to be the pinnacle of interspecies education, a shining beacon of unity where the galaxy's brightest young minds came together to learn, grow, and prepare for their futures among the stars. What a load of cosmic garbage that turned out to be. Instead, it was basically high school with tentacles and extra eyes. And just like every high school in the universe, apparently, it had its designated punching bag. Her name was Zyla, and she was what you might generously call an easy target. Standing barely 4 feet tall with powder blue skin that seemed to glow when she was nervous, which was basically always, she looked like someone had crossed a ferry with a nightlight. Her species, the Viridians, were known for their pacifist nature and their unfortunate tendency to change colors based on their emotions. Subtle as a neon sign in a blackout, which made hiding her feelings about as effective as a chocolate teapot. The Academy's resident psychopath was a charming fellow named Corax. Picture a crocodile that learned to walk upright, developed anger management issues, and somehow got accepted into higher education. His species, the Drachnari, were basically what happened when evolution decided that regular reptiles needed more teeth and a superiority complex. Corax had both in abundance, along with a gang of equally delightful individuals who followed him around like remoras on a particularly ugly shark. Every morning, like clockwork, the harassment would begin. Zyla would shuffle into the cafeteria, her skin already shifting to nervous purple, and Corax would be there waiting with the enthusiasm of a kid on Christmas morning. Except instead of presents, he got his kicks from making someone's day absolutely miserable. Well, look what the solar wind blew in. Corax would hiss, his forked tongue flicking out in what passed for amusement among his kind. Still glowing like a malfunctioning beacon, I see. His cronies would laugh, because apparently, having 2 brain cells to rub together was optional in their species. Zyla would duck her head, her skin cycling through embarrassed pink to fearful yellow, and try to find somewhere to sit where she could eat her algae paste in peace. Fat chance of that happening. The faculty, bless their collectively absent hearts, had perfected the art of selective blindness. Administrator Vex, a pompous gasbag from the Luxarian Empire, who looked like someone had inflated a purple potato and given it delusions of grandeur, had a particularly creative way of handling complaints about bullying. He called it character building through adversity, which was academic speak for not my problem. Young beings must learn to navigate social challenges independently. Vex would wheeze through his breathing apparatus whenever the rare teacher bothered to report an incident. It prepares them for the harsh realities of galactic society. Right, because nothing prepared you for adult life quite like having your lunch money stolen by someone who could bench press a small starship. That's where Jake Martinez came into the picture. Human, 22 years old, and participating in the Academy's exchange program, because apparently, Earth's educational system thought their students needed more cultural diversity. Jake had signed up thinking he'd learn about alien cultures, maybe pick up some advanced technology, and hopefully not get probed by anything with more than the standard number of appendages. Instead, he got a front row seat to the galaxy's most pathetic excuse for civilization. Jake had been at the Academy for exactly 3 weeks, when he first witnessed what would generously be called the Zyla situation. He was sitting in the cafeteria, trying to figure out if the green blob on his plate was supposed to be food or some kind of science experiment, when he heard the commotion. Oops. Corax was saying, though his tone suggested the incident was about as accidental as a planned invasion. Zyla was on the floor, her books scattered everywhere, her skin flashing distressed orange as she scrambled to collect her belongings. The other students just stepped around her like she was part of the furniture. Jake watched with growing incredulity as this cosmic-scale dumpster fire unfolded. This was supposed to be an advanced civilization. As Zyla hurried away, her skin now a mortified shade of deep purple, Jake found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, these so-called advanced species could use a little education from the supposedly primitive humans. Time to see what good old-fashioned human problem-solving could accomplish in this cosmic circus. Over the next few days, Jake made it his personal mission to document just how spectacularly these enlightened species had failed at basic social interaction. It was like watching a nature documentary, except instead of lions hunting gazelles, it was watching supposedly intelligent beings act like complete morons. The harassment wasn't just casual cruelty, it was systematic. Corax had turned tormenting Zyla into performance art. During study periods, he'd accidentally knock her datapad off her desk, sending her carefully organized notes scattering across the floor. When she'd bend down to collect them, he'd step on her fingers. Not hard enough to break anything, mind you, just enough to make her wince and her skin flash pain white. "So sorry," he'd say with all the sincerity of a used starship salesman. "These primitive desks are so low, maybe you should grow a few inches." His cronies would snicker because apparently, height-based humor was the peak of comedy across multiple star systems. Zyla would gather her things with shaking hands, her skin cycling through embarrassed pink to defeated gray, and continue with her work as if nothing had happened. The lunch theft had evolved into a daily ritual. Zyla would carefully select her meal, find a quiet corner to eat, and within minutes, Korax would materialize like a bad rash. He'd grab her tray, examine the contents with exaggerated disgust, and declare it unfit for civilized consumption, before dumping it in the nearest waste recycler. Then he'd hand her a nutrition bar from the vending machine. "Here," he'd say, as if he was doing her a favor. "Real food for real beings." Jake watched this cosmic circus act with the fascination of someone witnessing a slow-motion disaster. These beings had mastered quantum physics, but they couldn't figure out that maybe, just maybe, stealing someone's lunch every day was a problem. The other students would watch the show with the same enthusiasm they'd show for watching paint dry, then go back to their conversations about advanced theoretical mathematics. The group project incident was what really got Jake's attention. The class was divided into teams for a collaborative assignment on interspecies communication protocols. Ironic, considering half these species apparently couldn't communicate the basic concept of "don't be a complete waste of oxygen." Zyla raised her hand to join a group. Every single team suddenly became very interested in their shoes, their data pads, or the fascinating pattern of the ceiling tiles. The professor, a stick-thin being from the Altarian collective, who looked like someone had stretched a grasshopper until it achieved consciousness, pretended not to notice. "I suppose you can work alone," the professor said, as if forcing someone into isolation was just another teaching method. "It will be excellent practice for independent research." Jake watched Zyla's skin cycle through disappointed blue to resigned gray, and felt something that his species had a very specific word for: righteous indignation. On Earth, they had a saying about what happened when you cornered something that had nowhere left to run. These aliens were about to get a practical demonstration. He tried the diplomatic approach first, because contrary to popular belief, humans weren't always the shoot first, ask questions later species the galaxy seemed to think they were. Sometimes they asked questions while shooting, which was entirely different. After class, Jake approached Professor Stickbug with what he thought was a reasonable suggestion. "Hey Professor," Jake said, using his most diplomatic tone. "I noticed that student Zyla seems to be having some social integration issues. Maybe we could rotate group assignments to make sure everyone gets included." The professor's compound eyes focused on Jake with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex equation. "Human Jake Martinez, your concern is noted. However, social hierarchies establish themselves naturally. It is not our place to interfere with organic group dynamics." Organic group dynamics. That was what they called systematic exclusion in academic circles. Jake was starting to understand why his species had such a colorful vocabulary for describing bureaucratic nonsense. "Right," Jake said slowly. "Because watching someone get isolated and picked on is totally natural." "Got it." The professor's antenna twitched, which Jake had learned was the Altarian equivalent of a dismissive shrug. "Perhaps you should focus on your own academic integration rather than concerning yourself with others' social challenges." Translation: mind your own business, primitive human. Jake walked away from that conversation with a growing appreciation for why his species had developed such creative ways of expressing frustration. These beings had advanced technology, sophisticated social structures, and the collective empathy of a broken calculator. Time for Plan B. And Plan B, in human terms, usually involved a lot more creative problem-solving and a lot less patience for cosmic stupidity. The breaking point came during what the Academy optimistically called Cultural Presentation Week. Each species was supposed to share something meaningful about their heritage with the class. It was meant to foster understanding and appreciation for diversity. Instead, it became the galaxy's most expensive exercise in public humiliation. Zyla had prepared a presentation about Viridian art forms, specifically their traditional light-weaving techniques. For her people, light weaving was sacred, a way of expressing emotions through controlled bioluminescence that created intricate patterns in the air. She'd spent weeks practicing, and Jake had actually seen her working on it during lunch breaks, her skin glowing soft gold with concentration as she wove delicate spirals of light. The day of her presentation, Korax decided to provide his own special commentary. Zyla stood at the front of the class, nervous purple but determined, and began her demonstration. The patterns she created were actually beautiful. Jake had to admit. Flowing ribbons of soft blue light that danced and twisted in complex geometries, telling a story about her homeworld's twin moons and their eternal dance across the sky. How lovely, Korax interrupted, his voice dripping with sarcasm. A night light show, very useful for those of us who might get scared of the dark. His cronies snickered. A few other students shifted uncomfortably, but nobody said anything. The professor looked up from his datapad with mild annoyance, as if the interruption was the problem, not the harassment. Please continue, Student Zyla, Professor Stickbug said, already looking back down at his notes. Zyla tried. Her skin flickered between nervous purple and embarrassed pink as she attempted to regain her composure, but Korax wasn't done. I hear your people use this light trick to signal surrender, he said conversationally. Very practical, considering how often you probably need it. That got bigger laughs. Zyla's carefully controlled light patterns began to stutter and break apart. Her skin was cycling rapidly now, emotional confusion written across her entire body in living color. Actually, Korax continued, warming to his theme, isn't this just what your people do when they're about to wet themselves in fear? I think I read that somewhere. The laughter was getting louder, even some of the previously neutral students were grinning now. Zyla's light weaving collapsed completely, the beautiful patterns dissolving into random flickers. Her skin went through rapid-fire color changes. Shame red, fear yellow, desperation white. She started, her voice barely audible. I just wanted to share what? Korax pressed. How to bore an entire classroom to death. Mission accomplished. That's when Zyla broke. Her skin flashed brilliant white, then went completely gray, and she ran from the classroom. Not walked quickly, not made a dignified exit, but actually ran like something was chasing her. The door slid shut behind her with a soft hiss that somehow sounded like the universe's most pathetic punctuation mark. The classroom fell into the kind of silence that follows a particularly spectacular disaster. A few students looked uncomfortable, but most just shrugged and started packing up their things like watching someone's soul get crushed was just another Tuesday. Well, Professor Stickbug said, making a note on his datapad, I suppose we'll move on to the next presentation. Jake sat there for exactly 30 seconds, letting the sheer cosmic level stupidity of what he'd just witnessed fully sink in. Then he stood up, walked out of the classroom, and went straight to Administrator Vex's office. The administrator's office was exactly what you'd expect from someone who had achieved maximum bureaucratic evolution. Polished surfaces, meaningless awards, and the distinct smell of someone who had never had to solve an actual problem in their entire inflated existence. Administrator Vex, Jake said, not bothering with pleasantries. We need to talk about the bullying situation in Professor Althura's Xenocultural Studies class. Vex looked up from his desk with the expression of someone who had just been interrupted during very important administrator business, which probably involved finding new ways to avoid doing his job. Ah, human Jake Martinez, Vex wheezed. I trust you are finding your cultural exchange experience enlightening. Oh, it's enlightening all right, Jake said. I'm learning that apparently, advanced civilizations still haven't figured out how to prevent their students from being complete sociopaths. Vex's breathing apparatus made a sound like a deflating balloon. I'm afraid I don't understand your concern. Are you experiencing difficulties with your coursework? Not me, Zyla, the Viridian student who just got publicly humiliated while your professor sat there picking his antenna. Ah yes. Vex's expression suggested he was trying to recall who Zyla was, as if there were dozens of blue-skinned students getting tormented daily. Student Zyla. Yes, I'm aware of her. Social challenges. Social challenges. Right. Like being systematically harassed was a personal failing. So what are you going to do about it? Jake asked. Do. Vex inflated slightly, which Jake was learning was how his species expressed confusion. My dear human, these social dynamics serve an important educational function. Young beings must learn to navigate complex interpersonal relationships. Intervention would rob them of valuable character-building experiences. Character-building experiences. Jake felt something in his brain make a small popping sound, like a circuit breaker switching off. Let me get this straight, Jake said slowly. Your educational philosophy is that watching someone get emotionally destroyed in front of their peers builds character. Whose character, exactly? Why, everyone involved naturally. Student Korax learns leadership through social dominance. His peers learn the importance of group cohesion, and student Zyla learns resilience through adversity. Jake stared at the administrator for a long moment, processing this stunning example of bureaucratic logic. These beings had mastered interstellar travel, but they'd somehow missed the revolutionary concept that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to teach life skills than psychological torture. Right, Jake said finally. And what happens when I file a formal complaint with the Galactic Education Council about systematic harassment being institutionally ignored? Vex's breathing apparatus made a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. I'm afraid that would be inadvisable, human Jake Martinez. You are here as a cultural exchange participant. Your role is to observe and learn, not to interfere with established educational protocols. Translation: shut up, sit down, and mind your own business, primitive human. Jake nodded slowly, as if he was actually considering this sage advice. You know what, Administrator Vex, you're absolutely right. I should stick to what I know best. Excellent. I'm pleased we understand each other. Oh, we understand each other perfectly, Jake said, standing up. You've just taught me a very valuable lesson about advanced galactic civilization. He walked to the door, then paused and looked back at the administrator, who was already returning to his very important paperwork. You know what humans are really good at, Administrator Vex? I'm sure I couldn't say. Jake smiled, and something in that smile should have set off every warning system in Vex's inflated head. Problem solving. We're really good at problem solving. The door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. Time for these advanced civilizations to get a practical demonstration of human ingenuity in action. Jake found Corax and his merry band of evolutionary mistakes in their usual spot the next morning, the Academy's central courtyard where they like to hold court like some kind of discount reptilian royalty. They were lounging around a decorative fountain, probably planning their next act of cosmic jackassery, when Jake walked up and planted himself right in the middle of their little circle. Morning, gentlemen, Jake said with the kind of cheerful tone that should have immediately activated every prey instinct these predators had evolved. Mind if I join the conversation? Corax looked up from whatever passed for deep thought in his species, which probably involved figuring out which end of a stick was pointier. His yellow eyes narrowed as he tried to process this unexpected development. Human, he said, like the word itself was an insult. This is not your concern, move along. Oh, but it is my concern, Jake said, settling down on the fountain's edge like he owned the place. See, I've been observing your little social experiments, and I have to say, I'm impressed. It takes real skill to be this consistently terrible at existing. Corax's cronies exchanged glances. In their limited experience, prey animals didn't usually walk up to predators and start casual conversations about their inadequacies. You should be careful, human, Corax said, rising to his full height, which was admittedly impressive if you were into the whole oversized lizard with abandonment issues aesthetic. Your species is weak. Soft, you do not understand the natural order. Natural order, Jake repeated thoughtfully. Right. Let me guess, you're at the top because you're bigger and meaner. Everyone else falls in line because that's how nature works, and anybody who doesn't fit the pattern gets stomped on for their own good. Exactly, Corax said, pleased that the primitive human was finally grasping basic concepts. Fascinating, Jake said. And this natural order, it's working out well for you. You feel fulfilled? Accomplished? Like you're really making the most of that big brain evolution gave you. Corax's expression suggested he was trying to figure out if this was a trick question. His cronies were looking equally confused, which wasn't really a change from their usual state, but still, I dominate, Corax said, finally. I am strong, others are weak. This is the way. The way, Jake nodded sagely. Very philosophical, very deep. Tell me, Corax, what exactly are you accomplishing with all this domination? Besides making yourself the Academy's most pathetic example of wasted potential, the temperature in the courtyard seemed to drop a few degrees. Corax's eyes narrowed to slits. What did you say? Oh, I'm sorry, Jake said with exaggerated concern. Was that too complicated? Let me break it down for you. You're a textbook case of what happens when evolution gives someone all the tools for success and they use them to become the galaxy's most expensive waste of space. Corax's cronies made sounds that were probably supposed to be threatening, but came out more like confused whimpering. Their leader, meanwhile, was beginning to show signs of actual thought, which was probably painful for him. You dare insult me, human. Insult you. Jake looked genuinely surprised. I'm trying to help you. See, where I come from, we have a saying. The louder someone roars, the smaller their actual problems. And brother, you are roaring about some really small problems. What problems? Corax demanded, taking a step forward. Well, let's start with the obvious one, Jake said conversationally. You're so insecure about your own worth that you need to pick on someone half your size just to feel important. That's not strength, that's desperation with scales. Corax's jaw dropped slightly. His cronies looked like they were trying to process information that their brains weren't designed to handle. But wait, there's more, Jake continued. You're part of a species that supposedly evolved beyond primitive tribalism, yet here you are, acting like a cave-dwelling throwback who just discovered fire. Your people must be so proud. My people are warriors, Corax snarled. We're warriors, Jake corrected. past tense. Now they're mostly known for their contributions to interstellar diplomacy and advanced engineering. But you're still stuck in the hit things with rocks phase of development. It's like watching a grown adult play with baby toys. One of Korax's cronies, a particularly dim specimen named Grax, spoke up. You cannot speak to us this way, human. We are superior beings. Jake turned to look at Grax with the kind of attention usually reserved for interesting insects. Superior beings, he repeated. Right. Tell me, Grax, what's your contribution to galactic civilization? Besides following Korax around like a lost puppy. Grax opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. The sound that came out was like air escaping from a leaky tire. That's what I thought, Jake said. You know what's really funny? Zyla, the girl you've been tormenting, has already contributed more to interspecies understanding in her first semester than you've managed in your entire existence. Her research on bioluminescent communication patterns is actually being cited by xenobiologists across 3 sectors. She is weak, Korax insisted, but there was less conviction in his voice now. She's gentle, Jake corrected. There's a difference. Where I come from, we learned a long time ago that the strongest people are often the ones who choose not to use their strength. But you wouldn't understand that concept, would you? Korax was starting to look uncomfortable, which was probably the first genuine emotion he'd experienced in years. Let me tell you what I see when I look at you, Korax, Jake said, standing up. I see someone who's so afraid of being irrelevant that he's turned cruelty into a hobby. Someone who's so insecure about his place in the world that he needs to tear others down just to feel tall. And the really sad part, you're not even good at being a bully. Not good at, Korax started. Terrible at it, Jake confirmed. I mean seriously, your technique is embarrassing. You pick on the most obviously harmless person in the academy, you use the same tired insults every day, and your cronies are about as intimidating as a group of confused houseplants. If bullying were an art form, you'd be finger painting with mud. Korax's cronies were looking at each other with expressions of dawning horror. Someone was pointing out their flaws, and they weren't sure how to process this information. But here's the thing that really gets me, Jake continued, warming to his theme. You're not just failing at being a decent person, you're failing at being a proper villain. You want to know what real predators do? They don't waste time on easy targets. They don't need an audience to feel powerful. And they definitely don't spend their time making enemies out of people who could have been allies. Allies. Korax laughed, but it sounded forced. What could that weak creature possibly offer? Oh, I don't know, Jake said thoughtfully. How about access to one of the most extensive databases of Viridian biotechnology in the galaxy? Zyla's family happens to be one of the leading developers of organic computing systems. You know, the technology that makes your species' advanced starships actually work. The color drained from Korax's scales. His cronies looked like they were trying to swallow their own tongues. Or maybe, Jake continued, you'd be interested in the fact that her research advisor is Director Thane of the Galactic Science Council. You know, the same Director Thane who approves internship applications for advanced engineering positions. Korax was starting to look like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. His cronies were staring at him with expressions of growing panic. But hey, Jake said, with a shrug. Why would any of that matter to someone who's too busy proving how tough he is by picking on the Academy's most connected student? Connected? Grax squeaked. Oh, very connected, Jake confirmed. Her uncle is Admiral Vexstar of the Viridian Defense Fleet. You know, the same fleet that provides escort services for Draknari merchant vessels in the Outer Rim. I'm sure he'd be very interested to hear how his niece is being treated at this prestigious academy. Korax looked like he was about to throw up. His cronies were backing away from him, like he'd suddenly become radioactive. Now here's where it gets interesting, Jake said, his voice taking on a distinctly predatory tone. You see, humans have this weird thing about pattern recognition. We're really good at it. And I've been watching you long enough to know exactly what buttons to push to make your life absolutely miserable. You wouldn't dare, Korax said, but his voice cracked. Wouldn't I? Jake smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. See, the thing about humans is that we're persistence hunters. We don't give up, ever. We just keep coming, and coming and coming, and coming, until whatever we're hunting either changes its behavior or collapses from exhaustion. Korax took a step backward. So here's what's going to happen, Jake continued conversationally. You're going to apologize to Zyla, publicly, in front of the entire class, and then you're going to spend the rest of your time at this academy treating her, and everyone else, with the basic respect that any decent being should show to their fellow students. And if I refuse? Korax asked, trying to salvage some dignity. Jake's smile got wider. Then you get to find out what happens when a human decides to make someone's life their personal project. Trust me, you don't want that kind of attention. The silence in the courtyard was deafening. Korax looked around at his cronies, who were suddenly very interested in being anywhere else, then back at Jake, who was still smiling that terrifying human smile. You. Korax started. Am I making myself clear? Jake asked politely. Korax's shoulders sagged. For the first time since Jake had known him, the reptilian bully looked exactly like what he was, a frightened insecure child who'd finally met someone who wasn't afraid of him. Crystal clear, Korax mumbled. Excellent, Jake said, clapping his hands together. I'm so glad we could have this chat. Really brings species together, doesn't it? As Jake walked away, he could hear Korax's cronies starting to pepper their leader with panicked questions. Something about family connections and defense fleets, and whether they were all going to end up as space debris. Jake whistled a cheerful tune as he headed to his next class. Sometimes the best way to solve a problem was with superior firepower. Sometimes it was with advanced technology. And sometimes, if you were really lucky, all you needed was a good understanding of psychology and the willingness to use someone's own insecurities against them. Humans, as it turned out, were very good at all three approaches. The news of Jake's little chat with Korax spread through the academy faster than a hyperspace transmission. By lunchtime, every student in the facility had heard some version of the story, and like all good gossip, it had been embellished with each retelling until Jake had apparently made Korax wet himself, cry for his mother, and promise to become a vegetarian peace activist. The reality was almost as satisfying. Jake was sitting in the cafeteria trying to identify what species his lunch had originally belonged to when he noticed the change. Zyla walked in, and for the first time since he'd been at the academy, something remarkable happened. Students actually made room for her. Not grudgingly, not with obvious reluctance, but with what appeared to be genuine courtesy. A Centaurian student even pulled out a chair for her at one of the better tables, the ones near the windows with the view of the academy's botanical gardens. Zyla herself looked confused by this development. Her skin was cycling through puzzled blue and cautious yellow as she tried to process this sudden shift in social dynamics. She kept glancing around like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop, or in this case, for someone to dump her lunch in the recycler. Human Jake Martinez came a familiar wheeze from behind him. Jake turned to find Administrator Vex hovering nearby, his breathing apparatus working overtime. The administrator looked like someone who had just discovered that his carefully organized filing system had been replaced with abstract art. Administrator Vex, Jake said pleasantly. How's that character building going? Vex's expression suggested he was having difficulty processing recent events. I've received several interesting reports about an incident in the courtyard this morning. Really? What kind of reports? Reports suggesting that you engaged in what could be characterized as threatening behavior towards student Korax and his associates. Jake took a bite of his mystery meat and chewed thoughtfully. Threatening behavior? That's a serious accusation. I hope you have evidence to support it. Student Korax himself filed the complaint, Vex said, inflating slightly with bureaucratic authority. Ah, Jake nodded. And what exactly did student Korax claim I threatened him with? Vex consulted his datapad. He states that you, and I quote, use psychological manipulation to undermine his social standing and threaten to make his life a living hell through systematic harassment. Wow, Jake said, genuinely impressed. That's a pretty sophisticated understanding of social dynamics for someone who thought bullying was a legitimate educational tool. Maybe there's hope for him yet. This is not a joke, human Jake Martinez. If these allegations are substantiated, then what? Jake interrupted. You'll punish me for using the same techniques your star student has been using on Zyla for months, except I did it with words instead of physical intimidation. Vex's breathing apparatus made the sound of a deflating balloon. That is entirely different. How? Student Korax was engaged in natural social hierarchy establishment. You engaged in deliberate psychological warfare. Jake set down his fork and looked at the administrator with the kind of attention usually reserved for particularly fascinating bacteria samples. Let me see if I understand your position, Administrator Vex. When Korax systematically humiliates, isolates, and psychologically torments another student, that's natural social behavior that builds character. But when I point out the flaws in his logic and make him uncomfortable about his choices, that's psychological warfare. You cannot compare. Actually, I can. Jake said, pulling out his own datapad. See, humans are really good at documentation. We tend to keep records of interesting phenomena. Like for instance a detailed log of every incident of harassment I've witnessed since arriving at this academy. Vex's eyes widened as Jake scrolled through what appeared to be an extensive list of dates, times, witnesses and detailed descriptions of events. Day 3, Jake read aloud. Korax deliberately knocked Zyla's meal tray to the floor, then stepped on her hand when she tried to clean it up. Witnessed by approximately 30 students and Professor Althara, who chose not to intervene. Day 7, Korax blocked the library entrance until Zyla agreed to do his homework for him. Witnessed by librarian Kykestil, who apparently found it amusing. How did you? Vex started. Day 12. Korax convinced his study group to exclude Xyla from a mandatory collaborative project, forcing her to work alone on an assignment designed for 5 students. Professor Stickbug's response was to suggest she use it as an opportunity for independent learning. Jake looked up from his datapad with a pleasant smile. Should I continue? Because I have about 6 weeks worth of entries, complete with video recordings from the Academy's own security systems. The color drained from Vex's inflated features. Video recordings. Oh yes, humans are very thorough when we're documenting problems. We like to have evidence when we're solving them. Jake's smile got a little sharper. I'm sure the Galactic Education Council would find this data fascinating, especially the parts where Academy staff members actively enable harassment under the guise of educational philosophy. Vex made a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire. What? What do you want? Want? Jake looked surprised. I don't want anything, Administrator Vex. I'm just a cultural exchange student here to observe and learn. Remember? But surely there must be some arrangement we can— Actually, there is one thing. Jake said thoughtfully. I'd love to see the Academy's official policy on student harassment. You know, just for my cultural research. I'm particularly interested in the section that explains how systematic psychological abuse qualifies as character building. Vex's breathing apparatus was making increasingly distressed sounds. There may have been some misunderstandings about proper intervention protocols. Misunderstandings, Jake repeated. Right. Well, I'm sure those misunderstandings will be cleared up soon. Especially once the Academic Review Board sees my documentation. Academic Review Board. Oh, didn't I mention? I've been in contact with several Earth universities about establishing formal exchange programs with the Academy. They're very interested in our educational methodologies here. Very interested. Jake stood up, gathering his things. You know what's funny, Administrator Vex? Before I came here, I actually believed all that propaganda about advanced galactic civilization. I thought species that had mastered interstellar travel would have figured out basic social interaction. Turns out, some problems are universal. As Jake walked away, he could hear Vex frantically making calls on his communication device. Something about damage control and policy review, and how did we not know the human was recording everything? The afternoon brought even more interesting developments. Jake was heading to his xenobiology class when he noticed a small crowd gathered around one of the Academy's information displays. As he got closer, he could see what had captured everyone's attention. A formal apology notice posted on the student bulletin board. To student Xyla of Meridian V, the notice read in Korax's distinctive handwriting. I publicly apologize for my inappropriate behavior over the past several months. My actions were unbecoming of a member of this Academy's student body and contrary to the principles of mutual respect that should govern interspecies relations. I commit to conducting myself with appropriate dignity in all future interactions. It was signed, witnessed, and bore the official seal of the Student Conduct Office. Well, came a familiar voice. Jake turned to find Xyla standing beside him, her skin glowing soft gold with what he was learning to recognize as genuine happiness. It seems your conversation with Korax was quite effective. Just a friendly chat between classmates, Jake said innocently. How are you doing, Xyla? You seem brighter today. Her skin shifted to amused silver. Brighter is one way to put it. I haven't had anyone steal my lunch, knock my books around, or make jokes about my species' survival instincts all day. It's been remarkably peaceful. Funny how that works. Jake, she said, her voice growing serious. What you did this morning. I heard about it from at least 6 different sources. Each story was more dramatic than the last, but they all agreed on one thing. You stood up for me when no one else would. Yeah, well, Jake shrugged, suddenly feeling awkward. Where I come from, we have this crazy idea that people shouldn't be jerks to each other just because they can get away with it. Where you come from, Xyla repeated thoughtfully. Tell me, is Earth really as primitive as the academic databases suggest? Jake laughed. Depends on what you mean by primitive. We haven't figured out faster than light travel yet, and our social media platforms are still a dumpster fire, but we did manage to work out that bullying is bad somewhere around the time we invented agriculture. And yet it took a primitive human to teach that lesson to students from supposedly advanced civilizations. Yeah, Jake said, watching as more students stopped to read Korax's apology. Kind of makes you wonder what other basic life skills these advanced species might have missed, doesn't it? Xyla's skin shifted to thoughtful blue. You know, there's something I should probably tell you about those family connections you mentioned to Korax. What about them? Well, she said, with what sounded suspiciously like suppressed laughter. Admiral Vexter is indeed my uncle. And Director Thane is my research advisor. And my family does develop biotechnology systems. Okay, but the thing is, I never mentioned any of that to anyone here. I've been trying to make it on my own merits without trading on family connections. Her skin shifted to amused silver again. How exactly did you know? Jake felt his face go slightly red. I may have done some research after I saw how you were being treated. Figured if I was going to help, I should know what resources were available. Research. Okay, fine. I hacked the student database and cross-referenced your family name with military and academic directories. Sue me. Zyla laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. You hacked our security systems. Your security systems are about as sophisticated as a screen door. Seriously, my little sister could have broken that encryption with a basic home computer. Your little sister. Point is, Jake said quickly. The information was accurate, even if I shouldn't have had access to it. Oh, it was completely accurate. Zyla agreed. In fact, you undersold it. Uncle Vexter isn't just an admiral, he's the fleet commander for this entire sector. And Director Thane isn't just my advisor, she's also my godmother. Jake stared at her. Your godmother. She and my mother were roommates at the Galactic Science Academy. She's been looking forward to hearing about my experiences here. And you're telling me this now because, Zyla said, her skin shifting to mischievous gold. I thought you should know that when I write my next letter home, I'm going to have some very interesting stories to share. Stories about how the Academy's administration handles student welfare, and how a human exchange student accomplished more in one morning than the entire faculty managed in months. Jake felt a grin spreading across his face. You know what, Zyla? I think I'm going to like having you as a friend. The feeling is mutual, Jake Martinez. The feeling is very mutual. As they walked toward class together, Jake couldn't help but notice that other students were nodding respectfully to Zyla, making room for her in the hallways, and generally treating her like a person worthy of basic courtesy. It was amazing what a little applied human psychology could accomplish when properly motivated. Behind them, Administrator Vex was still frantically making phone calls, something about crisis management and policy reviews, and how do we explain this to the Board of Trustees? Jake whistled cheerfully as they walked. Sometimes the best part of solving a problem wasn't the solution itself, but watching everyone else scramble to figure out how they'd missed something so obvious for so long.
3 weeks later, the Galactic Academy for Higher Learning was a very different place. Not physically, of course. The buildings were still the same pretentious monuments to bureaucratic self-importance they'd always been. But socially, it was like someone had performed emergency surgery on the entire institution's collective conscience. The changes started small. Professor Stickbug, who had previously shown all the intervention skills of a decorative plant, suddenly developed an interest in classroom management. Group projects were now assigned by random selection, ensuring that no student could be systematically excluded. Lunch periods were monitored by rotating faculty members who had apparently rediscovered their ability to notice when students were being harassed. It's remarkable, Zyla commented, as they sat in the cafeteria, watching Professor Althara actually intervene when a group of Centaurian students tried to claim an entire table for themselves. It's like they all suddenly remembered they were supposed to be educators. Fear is a powerful motivator, Jake replied, taking a bite of what he'd finally identified as some kind of fermented algae cake. It wasn't good, but it wasn't actively trying to kill him, which counted as progress in galactic cuisine. The fear in question had arrived in the form of a surprise inspection team from the Galactic Education Council, accompanied by representatives from no fewer than 7 different species education ministries. Apparently, when the niece of a sector fleet commander and goddaughter of a science council director writes home about institutional failures, people pay attention. Administrator Vex had spent the entire week following the inspection looking like someone who had just realized his retirement portfolio was invested in exploding stars. The inspection team's preliminary report had used phrases like systematic institutional failure, negligence in duty of care, and Jake's personal favorite, educational environment, incompatible with civilized society. But the real change wasn't in policy, it was in culture. Students who had previously treated harassment as entertainment now found themselves in a social environment where such behavior was not just discouraged, but actively uncool. It was amazing how quickly pack dynamics shifted when the pack realized the alpha was actually just a scared bully with delusions of grandeur. Korax himself had become something of a case study in behavioral modification. After his public apology, he'd tried to lay low, but Jake had made sure that wasn't an option. Every time the reptilian former bully showed signs of reverting to his old patterns, Jake would appear with that peculiarly human combination of cheerful friendliness and barely contained menace. "Morning, Korax," Jake would say with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "How's that character development going? Still working on those interpersonal skills we discussed?" It was psychological maintenance, and Korax knew it. More importantly, everyone else knew it too. The former top predator had become a cautionary tale, and his cronies had either reformed or found themselves isolated as the Academy's social dynamics realigned around the novel concept of not being terrible to each other. You know, Zyla said, interrupting Jake's observation of the cafeteria's new social order, I got another letter from my godmother yesterday. Yeah? How's Director Thane enjoying her correspondence? Quite a bit actually. She's particularly interested in your approach to problem solving. Something about humans demonstrating innovative applications of social psychology in hostile environments. Jake nearly choked on his algae cake. She's studying my methods. Apparently your technique of using an opponent's own insecurities against them while maintaining plausible deniability is being analyzed by xenopsychologists across 3 sectors. Zyla's skin shifted to amused gold. You're becoming something of a celebrity in academic circles. Great, Jake muttered. That's exactly what I need. Fame as the guy who made a lizard cry using only words. Actually, that's not entirely accurate. Jake looked up to find a new voice had joined their conversation. Standing beside their table was a tall, elegant being with silvery skin and what appeared to be naturally occurring geometric patterns running along her arms and face. Her species was unfamiliar to Jake, but the way other students respectfully nodded as she passed suggested she was someone important. I'm Professor Kesazandra, she said, extending a graceful hand in the human gesture of greeting. Xenosocial psychology. I've been following your case with great interest. My case. Jake shook her hand, noting that her skin felt like warm metal. I didn't realize I was a case. Oh, you're definitely a case, Professor Kesazandra said, settling into an empty chair with fluid grace. What you accomplished here represents the first documented instance of successful cross-species social intervention using purely psychological methods. The implications are fascinating. I just got tired of watching someone get picked on, Jake said uncomfortably. Exactly, the professor said, her patterns shifting to what Jake guessed was excitement. Most species, when confronted with systematic aggression, resort to either direct physical confrontation or formal authority structures. Humans appear to have developed a third option: psychological warfare disguised as conversation. It wasn't warfare, it was just, you identified your opponent's primary psychological vulnerabilities, exploited his social insecurities, undermined his support structure, and forced him to capitulate, without ever raising your voice, or making an explicit threat. Professor Kesazandra continued. In military terms, that's a textbook example of asymmetric warfare. Zyla was trying not to laugh. Jake, I think you've accidentally become a military strategist. That's ridiculous, Jake protested. I just pointed out that he was being a jerk and made him think about the consequences of his actions. Yes, the professor agreed. And the way you did it demonstrates a level of social intelligence that most species don't develop until they've achieved interstellar civilization. Your species managed it while still confined to a single planet. We had a lot of practice, Jake said dryly. Turns out, when you're stuck on one rock with billions of other people, you either figure out how to resolve conflicts without killing each other, or you don't survive long enough to develop space travel. Professor Kesazandra's patterns shifted to what looked like intense interest. And this conflict resolution method, it's common among humans. Depends on the human, Jake said. But yeah, most of us learn pretty early that there's usually a way to solve problems without resorting to violence. Sometimes you just have to get creative about it. Fascinating, the professor murmured, making notes on a datapad. Would you be interested in participating in a formal study? The Xenosocial Psychology Department would love to document human conflict resolution techniques. Will it involve more paperwork and formal reports? Jake asked suspiciously. Extensive paperwork, the professor confirmed. Then absolutely not. Professor Kesazandra laughed, a sound like silver bells. I respect that position. However, if you change your mind, the offer remains open. What you've accomplished here could revolutionize how we approach interspecies social conflicts. As the professor left, Jake turned to Zyla with an expression of mild horror. Please tell me I'm not going to become some kind of poster child for human diplomacy. Too late, Zyla said cheerfully. You're already being cited in academic papers. I saw one titled Primitive Species, Advanced Solutions, a case study in human social engineering. I hate everything about that title. The abstract mentions your innovative use of strategic embarrassment and sophisticated understanding of hierarchical psychology. I just made fun of a bully until he gave up. This isn't rocket science. No, Zyla agreed, it's social science. And apparently, your species is very good at it. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another familiar figure. Korax approached their table hesitantly, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked almost like genuine humility. Human Jake, he said formally. Student Zyla, I hope I am not interrupting. Not at all, Jake said pleasantly, though his tone carried just enough edge to remind Korax of their previous conversation. What can we do for you? I wanted to. Korax paused, clearly struggling with unfamiliar concepts like humility and gratitude. I wanted to thank you. Jake raised an eyebrow. Thank me, for showing me what I had become, Korax said quietly. I had convinced myself that strength meant domination, that respect came from fear. You showed me that true strength comes from protecting others, not harming them. Xyla's skin shifted to surprised blue, then to warm gold as she realized Korax was being genuine. I have spoken with my family. Korax continued. They were ashamed of my behavior. My father reminded me that our people's greatest warriors were protectors, not predators. I had forgotten that distinction. And now? Jake asked. Now I remember, Korax said simply. I cannot undo what I did, but I can choose to be better. I wanted you both to know that. He turned to leave, then paused. Also human Jake. If anyone else tries to harm student Xyla, or any other student, they will answer to me. I may have been a poor leader before, but I intend to be a better one now. As Korax walked away, Jake and Xyla sat in stunned silence for a moment. Well, Xyla said finally. That was unexpected. Yeah, Jake agreed. Turns out even cosmic-level jerks can have character development arcs. Who knew? The semester continued with a steady stream of similar improvements. Students who had previously ignored harassment began speaking up. Faculty members who had hidden behind bureaucratic excuses started taking active roles in maintaining a positive learning environment. Even Administrator Vex, after surviving his review board hearing with only a formal reprimand and mandatory retraining, began showing signs of actual leadership. Jake's reputation as someone you definitely didn't want to cross became legendary throughout the academy. But more importantly, his reputation as someone who would stand up for others became equally well known. Students who might have become targets in the old system found themselves with an unexpected protector, and potential bullies found themselves facing the terrifying prospect of explaining their behavior to a human who had clearly mastered the art of creative embarrassment. You know, Xyla said one afternoon, as they studied together in the library. I've been thinking about what Professor Kesazandra said about human conflict resolution. Please don't tell me you're writing a paper about it too, Jake said, looking up from his quantum mechanics homework. Actually, I was thinking about something else. Your species developed these social skills while confined to one planet, right? Before you had access to the broader galactic community. Yeah, so imagine what you could accomplish now that you have access to interstellar civilization. Imagine what humans could teach the rest of us about actually living together peacefully. Jake considered this. You know, when you put it that way, maybe Earth isn't as primitive as everyone thinks. Maybe, Xyla said, her skin glowing soft gold with affection, the rest of us have something to learn from the primitive humans. As Jake looked around the library, seeing students from dozens of different species working together in harmony for the first time since he'd arrived, he had to admit she might have a point. Sometimes the most advanced solution was also the most obvious one. Treat people with basic decency and refuse to accept anything less from others. It wasn't rocket science, it was just human nature, and apparently, that was exactly what the galaxy needed. 3 months later, when Jake's exchange program ended, and he prepared to return to Earth, the Academy held a farewell ceremony in his honor. Students from every species represented at the Academy attended, including several who credited Jake with helping them find their voices when facing their own social challenges. Administrator Vex, in a speech that managed to be both pompous and genuinely grateful, announced that the Academy would be implementing a new conflict resolution program based on innovative human social intervention techniques. Jake tried not to cringe at the formal language, but he had to admit it was better than the previous system of pretending problems didn't exist. As his shuttle prepared for departure, Jake stood at the viewport looking back at the Academy. It looked the same as when he'd arrived, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving. Sometimes the most important changes were the ones you couldn't see from the outside. Ready to go home? Xyla asked, joining him at the viewport. She'd been accepted for an advanced research position on Earth, part of an expanded cultural exchange program that Jake suspected had something to do with his documented success at the Academy. Ready, Jake said. Though I have to admit, it's going to be weird going back to a planet where everyone already knows not to be jerks to each other. Oh, I don't know, Xyla said, her skin shifting to mischievous gold. I have a feeling Earth might be more interesting than you think. After all, if this is what one human can accomplish at a galactic academy, imagine what an entire planet of humans could teach the rest of the galaxy.
Jake grinned as their shuttle jumped to hyperspace. Maybe Earth wasn't ready for faster-than-light travel yet, but apparently, they were more than ready to show the rest of the galaxy a thing or two about basic human decency. And really, in a universe full of advanced civilizations that had somehow forgotten how to treat each other with respect, that might just be the most valuable export of all.